In March 2008, the body of 50-year-old oil magnate Ronald Harper was discovered in his study at his Brookfield, Texas mansion. An investigation uncovered the shocking details of his wife, Evelyn Harper's affair with their church pastor, Thomas Bradford. In July 2007, at First Light Baptist Church in Brookfield, a series of events began to unfold that would ultimately lead to betrayal, scandal, and murder. In 2008, the small, wealthy Texan town of Brookfield thrived on oil money, social gatherings, and strict Baptist values. Among its elite stood Ronald Harper, a 50-year-old oil magnate whose fortune was matched only by his insecurities. Ronald was a man who built his empire with grit and strategy, turning the family oil business into one of the state's most lucrative enterprises. Yet, despite his wealth and power, he carried a deep fear of inadequacy, a wound from a childhood spent trying to win his father's approval. This insecurity bled into his marriage with Evelyn Harper, a woman whose beauty and charm once seemed like the crown jewel of his success. Evelyn Harper, at 43, had everything others envied: luxury, status, and a doting husband. But behind the designer dresses and perfectly styled hair was a woman drowning in discontent. She had grown up in a middle-class family, watching her parents fight over bills and resent their unfulfilled dreams. Determined to escape that fate, Evelyn married Ronald, whose promise of security was impossible to resist. Yet over the years, the warmth between them faded. Ronald, consumed by his business, grew emotionally distant. Their marriage became a performance for the town, a perfect facade masking Evelyn's yearning for something more. Evelyn found that more in Pastor Thomas Bradford, a man who seemed to embody everything Ronald was not. Thomas, at 45, was charismatic, confident, and deeply involved in the lives of his congregation at First Light Baptist Church. On the surface, he was a man of God, preaching about humility and righteousness. But beneath his polished sermons was a man who craved admiration. Thomas had spent his life perfecting the art of influence, knowing exactly how to make people feel seen and valued, especially women like Evelyn, who longed for attention and validation. For Evelyn, her affair with Thomas began as a subtle, intoxicating escape from the confines of her life. She started attending church more frequently, initially under the guise of reconnecting with her faith. But soon, her visits became less about scripture and more about stolen glances and whispered words with the pastor. She told herself it was harmless at first, a connection she needed to feel alive again. But as the months passed, it evolved into something far more dangerous. Ronald Harper wasn't oblivious. He had always distrusted Thomas Bradford, though he couldn't fully articulate why. Perhaps it was the way the pastor's eyes lingered too long on the women in his congregation, or the overly familiar way he spoke to Evelyn after services. Ronald often brushed off these feelings, attributing them to his own insecurities. But by February 2008, the signs became impossible to ignore. Evelyn's behavior had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. She began neglecting responsibilities she once handled with precision. The household staff noticed her absence during key moments, skipping lunch appointments to attend last-minute church meetings, or disappearing for hours without explanation. Ronald, who had long relied on Evelyn to manage their home and social calendar, started noticing her excuses piling up. Her phone was always nearby, but rarely in plain sight, as if she was hiding something. By February 10, 2008, Evelyn's recklessness reached a new height. She had left her scarf in the church office, a distinct designer piece Ronald had gifted her for their anniversary. A staff member returned it to the Harper home, handing it directly to Ronald. Though Evelyn explained it away as a simple oversight, the moment planted a seed of doubt in Ronald's mind. His suspicions deepened when he found a receipt for a dinner reservation at a romantic restaurant in her purse. The date on the receipt matched a night she claimed to be at a church committee meeting. The distance between them grew, but Evelyn didn't seem to notice. She was too caught up in the thrill of her affair. Pastor Thomas was her confidant, someone who listened to her frustrations without judgment. They spent hours together under the pretense of church planning, stealing moments in his office, or taking long spiritual walks around the church grounds. For Thomas, the affair wasn't just about passion, it was about power. He enjoyed the control he had over Evelyn, knowing he could pull her attention away from her husband and into his orbit. By late February, Ronald confided in Sheriff Alan Baker, an old friend and one of the few people he trusted. Over coffee one morning, Ronald spoke about his concerns. He didn't accuse Evelyn outright, but shared his observations. He mentioned the scarf, the strange phone behavior, and the restaurant receipt. Alan listened carefully, urging Ronald to keep an eye on things, but to avoid jumping to conclusions. Privately, Alan suspected there was more to the story than Ronald was willing to admit, but he held back, knowing how fragile Ronald's pride could be. Meanwhile, Evelyn and Thomas became bolder. Evelyn would leave early for church on Sundays, claiming she needed extra time to prepare for her duties as part of the hospitality team. Thomas would find excuses to stay late after services, ensuring they had time alone. These moments felt like a world apart from the sterile routines of Evelyn's life at home. She began dressing differently, wearing more vibrant colors and makeup that accentuated her features. Friends noticed her newfound energy, but attributed it to her deepened faith. As of March 2008 it approached, the tension in the Harper household reached its breaking point. Ronald's observations turned into quiet investigations. He began following Evelyn discreetly, noting her patterns and piecing together her lies. He didn't want to confront her until he had undeniable proof. What hurt him the most wasn't the idea of losing Evelyn. It was the betrayal. He had built his life around the image of a perfect family, and her affair with Thomas threatened to destroy everything he had worked for. Unbeknownst to Evelyn, Ronald had already decided to take action. He planned to expose the affair in the most public way possible, choosing the upcoming baptism event on March 15, 2008, as his stage. For Ronald, it wasn't just about humiliation. It was about reclaiming control. If Evelyn and Thomas thought they could play him for a fool, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. By the time the baptism event arrived, Ronald's suspicions were no longer just thoughts. They were a storm brewing, ready to erupt. The morning of March 15, 2008, was unusually warm for spring in Brookfield, Texas. The First Light Baptist Church, a stately brick building surrounded by well-manicured lawns, was buzzing with excitement. It was a special day, the long-awaited baptism event. Families dressed in their Sunday best streamed into the church, filling the pews with anticipation. For weeks, the event had been promoted as a celebration of faith, a moment for the community to come together. No one could have imagined the chaos that was about to unravel. Evelyn Harper arrived early, as she often did for church events, her calm demeanor masking her unease. The affair with Pastor Thomas Bradford had grown increasingly intense over the months. What began as stolen moments had evolved into something dangerous, something she could no longer fully control. Despite the risks, she convinced herself that today would be uneventful. She trusted that Ronald, who rarely attended church with enthusiasm, would keep his suspicions to himself. But Ronald had been meticulously preparing for this day, his every move calculated. Inside the church, Thomas stood at the front, shaking hands and exchanging warm greetings with his congregation. His charisma was undeniable. People gravitated toward him, seeing him as a pillar of strength and morality. But beneath his polished exterior, Thomas harbored a growing sense of dread. He had noticed Ronald's piercing gaze in recent weeks, the way the man's eyes followed every interaction between him and Evelyn. Still, he dismissed his fears, convinced that no one could outmaneuver his charm. As the service began, the congregation sang hymns, their voices filling the sanctuary with harmony. Evelyn sat in the third row, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. She stole occasional glances toward Thomas, their silent connection still electric, despite the growing tension. Ronald, seated 2 rows behind her, clenched his fists, the evidence he had gathered burning a hole in his pocket. He had stayed up the night before, rehearsing the moment in his mind, preparing himself for the uproar his actions would cause. At the 10:37 a.m., the choir began a rousing rendition of Amazing Grace. The churchgoers swayed gently, absorbed in the melody. It was then, during the crescendo of the song, that Ronald decided to strike. Rising abruptly from his seat, he marched toward the pulpit, his shoes echoing sharply against the wooden floor. The music faltered as people turned to see him approach. The sudden interruption silenced the room. The sight of Ronald on the stage was shocking enough, but what came next shattered the illusion of peace. Without hesitation, Ronald pulled out a stack of photographs, proof of Evelyn and Thomas's affair. The images, candid and undeniably incriminating, showed the two of them in moments of intimacy. The betrayal was captured in stark, unforgiving detail. Evelyn's face in the photos was unmistakable, her trust in Thomas evident in every stolen glance and touch. The air in the church grew heavy as gasps rippled through the crowd. Some covered their mouths in disbelief, while others exchanged wide-eyed looks, unsure of what to do. Ronald's accusations, though spoken with an eerie calm, cut through the room like a knife. He demanded the congregation open their eyes to the man they had trusted, a man who had violated the sanctity of his position. Evelyn's world seemed to collapse in slow motion. She rose from her seat, her face pale, as she tried to approach Ronald, but the damage was already done. The photographs fluttered through the air like fallen leaves, landing on the pews and the floor. People bent down to pick them up, their shocked expressions growing more pronounced with each passing second. The whispers began almost immediately. fragments of judgment and condemnation spreading like wildfire. Thomas, standing just a few feet away, froze. For the first time in years, he was speechless. He had always been able to talk his way out of difficult situations, to spin the narrative in his favor, but this was different. The evidence was undeniable, and the betrayal was public. His polished reputation, the foundation of his influence, crumbled beneath him. Evelyn pleaded with Ronald, but he refused to look at her. His voice, steady but seething with anger, carried through the church as he declared his intent to divorce her. He didn't just accuse Evelyn of infidelity. He stripped her of her identity as his wife and as a respected figure in the community. He spoke of how he had given her everything, only to be repaid with betrayal. The weight of his words crushed Evelyn, leaving her standing there, utterly exposed. The congregation turned against her almost immediately. Women who had once envied her for her grace and charm now whispered about her deceit. Men who had admired her beauty avoided her gaze, their respect replaced with disdain. The church, a place where she had once felt powerful and adored, became a sea of judgment. Evelyn's attempts to explain herself fell on deaf ears. Her reputation was beyond repair. Thomas, desperate to salvage what he could, took a different approach. He addressed the congregation, his voice trembling as he spoke of human weakness and the power of forgiveness. But his words rang hollow. The same people who had once hung on his every sermon now looked at him with suspicion and disgust. As the reality of his actions sank in, Thomas made a decision that would later haunt him. He began to distance himself from Evelyn. Publicly, he expressed regret and a commitment to atone for his sins. Privately, he stopped taking her calls, leaving her to face the fallout alone. By March 16, 2008, the news had spread beyond the church walls. Brookfield's tight-knit community, known for its polite facade, reveled in the scandal. Evelyn, once the picture of elegance, became a cautionary tale. Invitations to social events disappeared, friends stopped calling, and even her favorite boutiques quietly refused her business. Ronald moved swiftly to initiate divorce proceedings, ensuring she would be cut off from his wealth. Evelyn found herself isolated, humiliated, and without resources. The man she had risked everything for had abandoned her, and the life she had built was gone. As she sat alone, in the echoing silence of her once grand home, the enormity of her choices weighed on her. Her anger, once directed at Ronald, began to shift toward Thomas. She had believed in him, trusted him, and now he was nowhere to be found. The scandal that began in a crowded church on a spring morning marked the beginning of Evelyn's descent. Stripped of her wealth, reputation, and support, she was left with little more than her bitterness and a simmering desire for retribution. On the night of April 2, 2008, Ronald is found dead in his study, his head bludgeoned with a decorative oil drill model. The scene suggests a crime of passion. Evelyn, now the prime suspect, claims innocence but has no alibi. The morning of the April 3, 2008 was gray and somber, a fitting backdrop for the grim scene unfolding at the Harper estate. The sprawling mansion, once a symbol of wealth and stability, now stood as the epicenter of a gruesome crime. Ronald Harper's lifeless body had been discovered by a housekeeper in his private study. The oil drill model, A decorative piece commemorating his first major business deal lay nearby, smeared with blood. The lack of forced entry immediately suggested the killer was someone Ronald had trusted, someone who had access to his home. Sheriff Alan Baker, a veteran lawman and close confidant of Ronald's, arrived on the scene just after 8 a.m. He moved through the study with a practiced eye, taking in every detail: the shattered glass from a knocked-over whiskey tumbler, the papers scattered across Ronald's desk, and the dark red stains that painted a grim picture of the violence that had occurred. As Alan examined the scene, his mind drifted to the conversations he'd had with Ronald in recent weeks, particularly the ones about Evelyn and her strange behavior. Ronald's words echoed in his memory, and Alan couldn't shake the feeling that this murder was deeply personal. By April 6, 2008, Evelyn Harper found herself sitting in a cold, stark interrogation room at the Brookfield Police Department. Her once glamorous appearance was dulled by exhaustion and fear, her carefully maintained image crumbling under the weight of suspicion. Evelyn denied any involvement in Ronald's death, claiming that he had enemies in the business world who would have plenty of motive to harm him. She spoke of competitors who envied his success and employees who had grudges. Her voice, while composed, carried an edge of desperation, as though she was trying to convince herself as much as the investigators. The detectives, however, were skeptical. They pressed Evelyn about her whereabouts on the night of the murder. Evelyn claimed she had been home alone, reading and preparing for a quiet evening. But there were inconsistencies in her timeline, small details that didn't quite add up. She grew defensive as the questioning continued, deflecting attention to Ronald's alleged enemies. She described him as a man who, despite his wealth, had made powerful adversaries. Yet the detectives noted her unease and the way her hands trembled when pressed about her recent interactions with Ronald. By the April 10, 2008, the investigation took a significant turn. Forensic analysis revealed traces of blood on a scarf that had been discarded in the Harper estate's trash bin. The scarf, a distinct piece Evelyn was known to wear, matched samples taken from the crime scene. Even more damning, her fingerprints were found on the oil drill model used as the murder weapon. The evidence painted a chilling picture, one that Evelyn struggled to explain. Her earlier calm began to falter as the weight of the findings pressed down on her. While Evelyn maintained her innocence, the detectives were starting to see cracks in her story. At the same time, Pastor Thomas Bradford was brought in for questioning. By now, Thomas had distanced himself from Evelyn entirely, framing her as an increasingly erratic figure in Ronald's final weeks. He spoke of moments when Evelyn had confided in him about her frustrations with Ronald, describing arguments that had escalated into threats. Thomas painted himself as an unwitting participant, someone who had tried to offer spiritual guidance but had been dragged into Evelyn's downward spiral. Detectives noted how quickly Thomas shifted blame, portraying Evelyn as unhinged. His account of their interactions suggested that Evelyn had become consumed by anger and desperation. While his statements added to the growing case against her, they also raised questions about Thomas's own role. His eagerness to distance himself seemed suspicious, though he provided no direct evidence linking himself to the crime. By April 15, 2008, New revelations deepened the investigators' case. A neighbor, Mrs. Darlene McAllister, came forward after overhearing a heated argument between Evelyn and Ronald the night of the murder. Darlene described loud voices and the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Though she had dismissed it at the time as a typical marital dispute, the timing now seemed far too coincidental. Her testimony placed Evelyn at the scene during a critical window, further undermining Evelyn's claims of innocence. Just 5 days later, on the April 20th, 2008, surveillance footage from a local boutique emerged, dealing another blow to Evelyn's defense. The video showed her purchasing the exact oil drill model found at the crime scene, just 1 week before the murder. In the footage, Evelyn appeared calm, casually chatting with the cashier as she completed her purchase. The detectives noted the eerie normalcy of her demeanor, a stark contrast to the violent act she would allegedly commit days later. The discovery of the footage sent shockwaves through the investigation team. It was the final piece of evidence they needed to solidify their case. Evelyn's carefully constructed alibi had unraveled completely. The once respected socialite now appeared to be a woman who had meticulously planned a murder, only to be undone by her own arrogance and carelessness. Throughout the investigation, the emotional connections between the key players added layers of complexity to the case. Evelyn's betrayal of Ronald, both through her affair and his eventual murder, underscored the fragility of their marriage. Ronald, who had loved her despite his suspicions, had met a tragic end at the hands of the woman he once trusted most. Thomas's role in the saga was equally tangled. While he sought to protect himself, his willingness to throw Evelyn under the bus highlighted the selfishness that had driven their relationship from the start. What had once been a passionate, clandestine affair was now reduced to bitter accusations and blame-shifting. Evelyn, isolated and cornered, realized too late that Thomas had never truly cared for her beyond the thrill of their secret. The investigators, piecing together the timeline and relationships, recognized the emotional volatility that had fueled the crime. Evelyn's desperation to regain control of her unraveling life, coupled with Thomas's manipulation and Ronald's distrust, created a perfect storm. What had begun as a private betrayal had spiraled into a public tragedy, leaving a trail of shattered lives in its wake. As the investigation drew closer to its conclusion, Evelyn's carefully curated world was in tatters. The evidence, the testimonies, and the undeniable links to the crime all pointed in one direction. Evelyn Harper, once the epitome of elegance and privilege, now stood at the center of a web of deceit, facing the harsh reality of her actions. The fallout was only beginning, and the town of Brookfield braced itself for the final revelations. The morning of May 5th, 2008, dawned quietly in Brookfield, Texas. Evelyn Harper was in her lavish but eerily empty home, a shell of its former warmth. The once bustling household now echoed with silence, her staff gone, her social circle shattered. She moved about her day with the same grace that had once defined her, determined to cling to the last remnants of her dignity. Yet beneath her calm facade, Evelyn was unraveling. She knew the investigation was closing in, and the weight of the mounting evidence loomed like a storm. At precisely 7:45 a.m., a line of police cars pulled into the circular driveway of the Harper estate. Sheriff Alan Baker stepped out first, flanked by detectives and uniformed officers. Evelyn watched from her kitchen window as they approached, their presence purposeful and grim. She stood frozen for a moment, clutching the edge of the counter, before smoothing her dress and walking to the door. When she opened it, her face was a mask of composure, but her trembling hands betrayed her nerves. The officers informed her of the charges: first-degree murder. For a moment, she remained silent, her expression unreadable. But as the cold steel of handcuffs snapped around her wrists, the cracks in her calm began to show. Her breathing quickened, her eyes darting to the faces of the officers as though searching for mercy. The realization that her carefully curated life was over struck like a blow. The humiliation of being escorted out of her home, her neighbors peering from behind their curtains, was unbearable. Evelyn, once the queen of Brookfield society, was now reduced to a spectacle. By July 2008, the Harper murder trial had captured the attention of the nation. The scandal, with its explosive mix of wealth, betrayal, and a salacious affair, made headlines in every major newspaper. The courthouse in Brookfield overflowed with reporters, sketch artists, and curious locals eager to witness the drama unfold. For a small town steeped in conservative values, the trial was both a source of shock and a guilty pleasure. Evelyn sat at the defense table, her appearance meticulous despite her circumstances. She wore simple but elegant outfits, her hair and makeup carefully done, as though trying to remind the world of the woman she once was. But her eyes told a different story. They were tired, haunted by the unraveling of her life, and the knowledge that this trial would determine her future. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Caroline Pierce, wasted no time in painting Evelyn as a scorned and desperate woman. They detailed the unraveling of her marriage, the public humiliation of the Baptist event, and her affair with Pastor Thomas Bradford. They presented the evidence methodically: the bloody scarf, her fingerprints on the murder weapon, and the surveillance footage of her purchasing the oil drill model. The narrative was damning. Evelyn, they argued, had been driven to murder by anger, humiliation, and a desire to regain control over her life. The courtroom sat in rapt attention as witnesses took the stand. The housekeeper recounted the day she found Ronald's body, her voice trembling as she described the horror of the scene. Forensic experts explained the blood patterns and the timeline of the crime. Neighbors, like Mrs. Darlene McAllister, testified about the loud arguments they overheard and the tension between Evelyn and Ronald in the weeks leading up to his death. Perhaps the most shocking testimony came from Pastor Thomas Bradford. Called by the prosecution, he portrayed Evelyn as erratic and unstable. He admitted to the affair but claimed he had tried to distance himself when he realized how deeply Evelyn's emotions ran. He described moments when Evelyn spoke of wanting to end her problems, alluding to a growing darkness in her mind. His words, while carefully chosen to protect his own reputation, painted a devastating picture of Evelyn's state of mind in the weeks before the murder. Evelyn's defense team, led by attorney Paul Grayson, worked tirelessly to shift the narrative. They argued that Evelyn had been framed, pointing to Ronald's business rivals and even hinting at Thomas's possible involvement. They depicted Evelyn as a victim of circumstance, a woman who had been manipulated by powerful men and whose life had spiraled out of control. The defense team emphasized the lack of direct witnesses and questioned the reliability of some evidence, particularly the scarf, which they suggested could have been planted. Despite their efforts, Evelyn's own demeanor worked against her. While she remained composed for much of the trial, moments of visible anger and frustration broke through. Jurors noticed how her mask slipped when Thomas testified, her eyes narrowing and her lips pressing into a thin line. The emotional undercurrents between them were palpable, revealing the tangled web of betrayal and resentment that had defined their relationship. On August 12, 2008, the jury returned with their verdict after less than 5 hours of deliberation. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson read the words, "Guilty of first-degree murder." Evelyn sat motionless, her face unreadable as the weight of the decision sank in. Her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder, but she didn't react. The room buzzed with a mix of relief and whispers as reporters rushed to file their stories. The judge sentenced Evelyn to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The once glamorous socialite who had lived in luxury and wielded influence now faced a stark future behind bars. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her calm exterior cracked once more. Her eyes welled with tears, and her shoulders slumped, a stark contrast to the proud and composed figure she had once been. The trial left the town of Brookfield in a state of reflection. Ronald's tragic death, Evelyn's descent into infamy, and Thomas's cowardly attempts to save himself became the talk of the town for years to come. Evelyn's story, with all its layers of betrayal and ambition, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked desires and the cost of secrets. For those who had once admired her, there was now only pity and a lingering sense of disbelief. Evelyn Harper, who had once seemed untouchable, had fallen farther than anyone could have imagined. Evelyn becomes a cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. Her name is whispered in hushed tones in the community. Thomas moves away, his reputation permanently tarnished. Ronald's estate is donated to charity, his legacy overshadowed by the scandal. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss our daily updates. Be sure to check out another jaw-dropping case we have. The story of how a Christian wife's affair with her brother-in-law turned deadly. Let us know your thoughts in the comments.